far beyond the reach of any telescope built by young civilizations, in a region of space where the stars burn colder and the silence runs deeper, there existed an empire that had never known defeat. They called themselves the Varathi Dominion, and for 11,000 years they had conquered, absorbed, or erased every species that dared to rise among the stars. Their fleets were vast beyond imagination, kilometers-long warships shaped like obsidian blades, each one capable of glassing a planet's surface in under an hour. Their armies did not simply win wars. They ended the possibility of resistance before the first shot was ever fired. The Varathi did not conquer out of hatred. That would have required them to see other species as equals worth hating. No, they conquered out of certainty. A cold, absolute certainty that they were the pinnacle of evolution, and that all lesser life existed only to be catalogued, judged, and either absorbed into the Dominion or quietly, efficiently erased. Species after species had tried to stand against them. The Krill ascendancy, with their crystalline hive minds, fell in 3 days. The Torvain Combine, masters of gravitic weaponry, lasted only slightly longer. Even the legendary Othsarai, a race so ancient they had built Dyson swarms before the Varathi had learned to smelt iron, were reduced to a footnote in the Dominion's endless archive of the conquered. 11,000 years. Not one species had ever made them retreat. And then, in the outer spiral arm of a galaxy they had not yet fully charted, a Varathi scout vessel picked up a signal. Faint, chaotic, broadcasting on frequencies so primitive they almost dismissed it as background noise. It was music. Something about that signal, messy, emotional, utterly unlike the clean mathematical broadcasts of every other species they had ever encountered, made the scout captain pause. He should have kept moving. He should have logged it as insignificant and continued the survey. Instead, he changed course. He had no way of knowing that this single decision would become the most studied moment in Varathi history, the moment their empire first brushed against a species they would never, ever forget. The world was called Kaloth Station by the humans who lived there, a mining and research outpost on the edge of explored space. Barely 300 people strong, tucked into the frozen crust of a moon nobody back on Earth could pronounce correctly. It was not a military installation. It was not even particularly important. Just miners, engineers, a handful of scientists, and their families, living out their lives in metal corridors under an alien sky. Commander Elena Reyes had been stationed there for 4 years. She was not a soldier by nature. She had trained as an engineer, then as a station administrator, and only reluctantly accepted the title of commander when the previous one retired and nobody else wanted the paperwork. She kept a garden of hydroponic tomatoes in her quarters. She played guitar badly. She was, by every metric the Varathi valued, an utterly unremarkable specimen of an insignificant species. She had no idea that in 6 hours, she would become the reason an empire 11,000 years old would begin for the first time to doubt itself. The Varathi scout ship arrived without warning, sliding out of the black like a blade unsheathing. Its sensors swept across Kaloth Station in seconds, cataloging every heat signature, every structural weakness, every possible point of failure. The ship's commander, a towering being named Zorith Van, his species averaged nearly 8 feet in height, built from dense, corded muscle beneath plates of natural bioarmor, studied the readouts with the bored efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Primitive, he thought. Fragile. No orbital defenses, no shielding. A single strike would end them. He opened a channel, more out of procedural obligation than curiosity. Unknown settlement, his translator broadcast, the words flat and mechanical. You are within Varathi Dominion survey space. Identify yourselves or be classified as hostile. There was a pause. Then a voice answered. Calm, steady, almost conversational. This is Commander Elena Reyes, Kaloth Research Station. We're not hostile. We're not much of anything, honestly. Just a mining outpost. Who exactly are we talking to? Zorith's antennae twitched. The Varathi equivalent of surprise. No fear in her voice. No panic. Just calm curiosity. As if she were greeting a neighbor rather than a warship that could vaporize her entire station in a single volley. Interesting, he thought. Foolish, but interesting. You stand before the Varathi Dominion, he replied. In 11,000 years, no species has resisted our authority and survived. I offer you the chance every conquered world was given. Submit and you will be catalogued. Resist and you will be erased. Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, laughter. Not mocking, not defiant. Just tired, human laughter. The kind that comes after a very long day. Look, Elena said. I've got a coolant leak in Bay 4. 3 kids under the age of 10 who haven't seen sunlight in real years. And a supply ship that's 12 days overdue. I genuinely don't have the bandwidth for an ultimatum today. Can we maybe start with a hello? Zorath stared at his console for a long moment, uncertain how to process what he had just heard. In 11,000 years, the Dominion had recorded terror, defiance, desperate pleading, and cold, strategic calculation from species facing first contact. They had never once recorded exhaustion. He would not understand until much later that this single, throwaway response, this unwillingness to perform fear on command, was the very first crack in a belief system that had never been challenged. He ordered a boarding party prepared just in case. The Varathi boarding shuttle descended onto Kaloth Station's landing pad 3 hours later, its hull venting frost into the thin atmosphere. 12 Varathi warriors disembarked, each one nearly twice the height of the humans who came out to meet them, armed, radiating the quiet menace of a species that had never needed to bluff. Elena walked out to greet them without a weapon in sight. Behind her stood perhaps 20 station residents, unarmed, wrapped in thermal jackets, more curious than afraid. A few children peered out from behind adults' legs, wide-eyed at the towering aliens rather than terrified. Zorath, leading the party personally, found this deeply unsettling. Fear was supposed to precede negotiation. Fear was the natural order of things. Without it, he could not calculate leverage. You do not flee, he observed, his translator flattening the words into something almost accusatory. You do not resist. Explain. Elena shrugged, a gesture the Varathi had no equivalent for, and therefore found faintly disturbing. Running seems pointless if you can catch us anyway, and resisting seems pointless if we can't win. So, we figured we'd just talk instead. Radical idea, I know. One of the younger Varathi warriors, Sarath, barely 2 centuries old by their reckoning, still eager to prove himself, stepped forward, his voice carrying the contempt of someone who had studied 1,000 conquered species and found them all, ultimately, the same. Your species is weak, Sarath said. No armor, no visible weapons, no defensive fleet. You have already lost. You simply have not yet realized it. What happened next would be replayed in Varathi military academies for the next 2 centuries as a case study in the dangers of assumption. A small girl, no older than 7, her name recorded later as Mira Okonkwo Reyes, stepped out from behind her mother's leg, walked directly up to Sarath's armored boot, and looked all the way up at his face without a trace of fear. You're really tall, she said. Do you want to see my drawing? I drew a spaceship. It's not as good as yours probably, but I worked really hard on it. Sarath stood frozen, utterly unequipped by 11,000 years of conquest to process a child offering him crayon artwork in the shadow of an armed invasion force. The Varathi did not have children the way humans did. Their young were raised in communal creches, shielded entirely from adults until they reached functional maturity. The concept of a child approaching an armored soldier without instruction, without calculation, purely out of open-hearted curiosity, broke something fundamental in his understanding of how lesser species were supposed to behave. He did not know it yet, but that single moment, a small girl and a piece of paper, would matter more to the fate of Kaloth Station than any weapon either side possessed. Zorath intervened before the situation could unravel further. We are not here for children's drawings, he said, though something in his tone had shifted, almost imperceptibly. We are here to determine whether your species will submit or be catalogued for elimination. Elena's expression did not change, but something in her eyes hardened. Before you decide that, she said quietly, You should probably know what you're actually dealing with. Would you like to see our station? All of it. No hidden rooms, no tricks, just see us. Then decide. Zoreth almost refused. Every protocol demanded refusal. The Dominion did not negotiate, did not tour, did not extend courtesy to species awaiting judgment. But something about her offer, so calm, so without deception, made him pause. Very well, he said. Show us. He would spend the rest of his life regretting and treasuring that decision in equal measure. The tour began in Kaloth's medical bay, where a station doctor named Priya Nandakumar was treating a young miner's broken arm, the result of an equipment malfunction 2 days prior. Zoreth watched with clinical detachment as she worked, until he noticed something the Dominion's medical protocols had never accounted for. She was talking to the patient the entire time, not issuing instructions, not reciting diagnostic data, simply talking, asking about his family, distracting him gently from the pain, laughing softly at some quiet joke between them. Explain this behavior, Zoreth said, gesturing at the interaction. The conversation serves no medical function. Priya glanced up, unbothered by the towering alien looming in her doorway. It's called bedside manner, she said. Pain is easier to bear when you're not facing it alone. Fear doubles when it's silent. She returned her attention to her patient. Almost done, Marcus. You're doing great. Zoreth filed the observation away, uncertain of its significance, though something about it lodged in his mind like a splinter he could not quite remove. The tour continued through the station's hydroponics bay, where an elderly engineer named Tobias Whitfield was patiently teaching a group of children how the water reclamation systems worked. Not because it was required, but because, as he put it, somebody's got to know how to fix this place when I'm gone, and it might as well be them. It continued through the communal dining hall, where Zoreth watched 300 humans of wildly different backgrounds, miners, scientists, engineers, families, share meals together, argue about trivial things, laugh at each other's jokes, and generally exist in a state of chaotic, undisciplined togetherness that the rigidly hierarchical Varathi found almost impossible to comprehend. Your species lacks structure, Zoreth observed. No clear chain of command visible in this space. No enforced silence, no discipline. Elena smiled faintly. We have structure. It's just not the kind you're looking for. Command doesn't mean silence, Zoreth. Sometimes the strongest structures are the ones that let people be loud. He did not respond. He was beginning to suspect that his entire framework for understanding lesser species, built across 11,000 years of conquest, might not apply here at all. But the moment that would truly break something open in him came last, in the station's small observation deck, where the group found a single figure sitting alone. A young man, perhaps 25, staring out at the stars with an expression Zoreth's translator struggled to categorize. That's James, Elena said quietly. His father was on the supply ship, the one that's 12 days overdue. Zoreth turned to look at the young man more closely. There was no wailing, no visible collapse, just a quiet, aching stillness, grief held with a kind of dignity the Varathi had never associated with a primitive species. He grieves for someone not yet confirmed dead, Zoreth said. This is inefficient. Emotional expenditure without confirmed cause. Elena's expression tightened, the first flash of real emotion she had shown all day. That's not inefficiency, she said. That's love. It doesn't wait for confirmation, Zoreth. It doesn't need permission. It just is. And it's the exact same thing that will make every single person on this station fight for each other if you decide to hurt us today. For the first time since arriving at Kaloth Station, Zoreth Van felt something he had no name for. He would later learn the human word for it. It was called doubt. That evening, aboard the Varathi scout ship, Zoreth convened with his second-in-command, a battle-scarred veteran named Draith Cool, to determine Kaloth Station's fate. Recommendation, Draith said flatly. The station has no defensive capability, no weapons detected beyond basic mining equipment. Population is soft, undisciplined, emotionally volatile. Full submission is the logical outcome. Resistance, if attempted, would be brief. Zorath said nothing for a long moment, staring at the tactical display showing Kaloth's tiny, fragile silhouette against the vast dark. "There is something we are missing," he said finally. "Sentiment," Draith said, not quite hiding his disdain. "You spent too long among them today. They are primitives, Commander. Their compassion is a weakness. It will be their undoing, as it has been for every species that valued feeling over strength." "Perhaps," Zorath said. "Or perhaps we have simply never encountered a species whose weakness and strength are the same thing." Draith did not understand. Zorath was not entirely certain he understood it himself. But something about the young man grieving quietly on the observation deck, something about a child offering crayon art to an armored soldier, something about a doctor whose medicine included kindness. It all sat wrong against everything the Dominion had ever taught him about the nature of conquest. He ordered a formal ultimatum delivered the following morning: full submission, or the station would be destroyed within 72 hours. He did not expect what would happen next. Elena Reyes called an emergency meeting in the station's central hall within an hour of receiving the ultimatum. Every resident who could attend did, miners still in their work gear, scientists pulled from half-finished experiments, parents with children clutched against their sides. 300 people crammed into a hall meant for half that number, the air thick with fear that, for the first time since the Varathi's arrival, was finally visible on human faces. "They want an answer in 72 hours, Elena said, her voice carrying without need for amplification. "Submission or destruction. I won't lie to any of you. We don't have the firepower to fight them, not even close." A heavy silence settled over the room. Somewhere near the back, a child began to cry softly, quickly hushed by a parent's embrace. "So what do we do?" A miner named Dietrich called out, his voice cracking with barely restrained fear. "We just surrender?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, steadier, harder, carrying the weight of a decision already made. "No," she said. "We don't surrender. And we don't fight either. Not with weapons we don't have. We do something they've apparently never seen before in 11,000 years." "What's that?" Dietrich asked. Elena's eyes swept across the room, across the miners, the scientists, the families, the children, and something in her expression softened into something fiercer than any weapon the Varathi possessed. "We show them who we are," she said. "All the way down. No performance, no pretending to be stronger or scarier than we are. Just the truth of us. And we let them decide with open eyes whether that's something worth destroying." It was, by any strategic measure, an insane plan. There was no fleet to rally, no secret weapon to unveil, no clever trick to even the odds. Just 300 people, choosing to stand exactly as they were. But something remarkable began happening over the following 2 days. Something that no Varathi tactical model could have predicted. The station did not fracture into panic, it came together. Priya organized triage stations, not for battle wounds but for the elderly and children, ensuring they would be sheltered regardless of outcome. Tobias gathered the younger engineers and, rather than building weapons, spent his remaining hours teaching them everything he knew about the station's systems, knowledge that would outlive him if it came to that. Dietrich, still afraid, found himself standing beside neighbors he barely knew the week before, sharing stories, sharing fears, sharing what might be their final meals together with a kind of raw, unguarded honesty that felt more like home than any moment in his life before. And James, the young man mourning his father, spent those final hours not in isolation but surrounded. Neighbors he'd never spoken to brought him meals. Children drew him pictures. An elderly woman named Margaret sat with him for hours, simply holding his hand, saying nothing at all, because sometimes nothing needed to be said. Zorath watched all of this unfold through the station's monitoring feeds, which Elena had left deliberately unblocked, an act of transparency the Dominion had never once encountered from a species awaiting judgment. He watched 300 people facing annihilation choose gentleness over despair. He watched them choose each other. And somewhere in the cold silence of his own quarters, Zoreth Van, commander of a fleet that had never known defeat, began, for the first time in his 1100-year life, to genuinely question everything the Dominion had ever taught him about strength. On the morning of the third day, Zoreth summoned Elena Reyes to the observation deck of his ship, alone, without escort or ceremony. She arrived without fear in her eyes, though the exhaustion of 2 sleepless nights showed plainly on her face. "Your time has ended," Zoreth said, though something in his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. "I require your answer. Submission or destruction." Elena looked out at the vast dark beyond the viewport, at the tiny frozen moon that held everyone and everything she loved, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that seemed to unsettle him more than any threat could have. "We won't submit," she said. "Not because we think we can beat you. We can't. You could erase us in seconds, and we both know it. We won't submit because submission means pretending we're not who we are, and we'd rather die as ourselves than live as something smaller." Zoreth's antennae twitched violently, the Varathi equivalent of profound distress. "You choose annihilation over survival," he said. "This is irrational." "Maybe," Elena said. "But let me ask you something, Zoreth. In 11,000 years, how many species submitted out of fear?" He did not answer immediately. "All of them," he said finally. "Every species we have ever catalogued chose submission over destruction, without exception. And how many of them," Elena continued quietly, "actually respected you afterward? How many served the Dominion because they believed in it, versus how many simply obeyed, because they were terrified of what happened if they didn't?" Zoreth said nothing. The question had never been asked of him before, not once in over a millennium of conquest. He realized, with a cold and creeping horror, that he did not know the answer, that the Dominion had never once bothered to ask it of itself. "You've built the largest empire in known space," Elena said, "on a foundation of fear. And fear is very good at making people kneel, Zoreth. But it has never once, in the history of any species anywhere, made anyone love you. And empires built without love don't last. They just wait for the day the fear runs out." Zoreth stared at her for a long, silent moment, something shifting behind his ancient alien eyes, something that had never shifted before, not once, in 11,000 years of unbroken conquest. "You would truly die," he said slowly, "for the right to remain yourselves?" "Every single person on that station," Elena said without hesitation. "Everyone." It was in that moment, not in a battle, not in a clever trick, not in some hidden weapon revealed at the last second, that the Varathi Dominion's 11,000-year winning streak finally, quietly, irrevocably ended. Not because humanity defeated them, because humanity refused to let them win in the way that mattered. Zoreth did not fire on Kaloth Station. He did not report back to Dominion Command that he had conquered a new world, as protocol demanded. Instead, for the first time in his long military career, he did something no Varathi commander had ever done. He asked a question he was not authorized to ask. "Why?" he said to Elena, his voice carrying something that might in a human have been called vulnerability. "Does your species value something as fragile as love, when strength is so clearly the more useful trait for survival?" Elena considered the question with the same weight she might have given any life or death matter, because in truth, it was exactly that. "Strength keeps you alive," she said finally. "But love is the only thing that makes staying alive worth anything at all. You've conquered 11,000 years of species, Zoreth. Tell me honestly, in all that time has anyone ever looked at you the way that little girl looked at your soldier yesterday? Not with fear, not with calculation, just curiosity, openness, the belief that maybe, just maybe, you were someone worth knowing rather than someone to be afraid of?" Zoreth was silent for a long time. "No," he admitted finally. "No one ever has. That's the difference," Elena said gently. "You've spent 11,000 years being feared. We've spent our entire short, fragile history trying against every odd to be loved. And I think, somewhere in that difference, is everything you actually came here looking for, even if you didn't know it yet. Something broke open in Zorith Van in that moment. Not a weakness, but a long-buried recognition of something his own species had lost so many millennia ago that they had forgotten it ever existed. He thought of his own creche-raised childhood, devoid of the small, unguarded warmth he had witnessed in every corner of Kaloth Station. He thought of 11,000 years of conquered worlds, all of them kneeling in fear, none of them ever once looking at the Dominion the way that small girl had looked at Serath. He realized, with a clarity that shook him to his ancient core, that the Dominion had won every war it had ever fought, and in doing so, had never once actually won anything at all. Zorith Van did not destroy Kaloth Station. He did not report it for elimination. Instead, he did something that would echo through Varathi history for centuries to come. He filed a formal report to Dominion Command recommending an immediate and unprecedented halt to hostilities, along with a request that had never once been made in the Empire's 11,000-year existence. He requested to study humanity, not as a species to be conquered, but as one to be understood. The request was denied 3 times by Dominion High Command, each rejection more furious than the last. Conquest was the Dominion's only language. Curiosity was not in its vocabulary. But Zorith, having witnessed something he could not unsee, refused to let the matter rest. He returned to Kaloth Station not as a conqueror, but, for the first time in Varathi history, as a guest. Over the following months, something extraordinary began to unfold. Varathi scholars, initially sent only to catalog what Dominion Command dismissively called primitive emotional anomalies, found themselves instead documenting something they had no framework to properly describe, a species that built its entire civilization not on the absence of fear, but on the deliberate, daily choice to act with kindness despite fear. They studied Priya's bedside manner and realized it healed patients faster than clinical efficiency alone ever could. They studied Tobias's patient teaching and realized that knowledge freely shared created resilience no hoarded secret ever could. They studied the community that had gathered around James in his grief and realized that shared sorrow, rather than weakening a group, forged bonds stronger than any military discipline the Dominion had ever engineered. And they studied Mira, the small girl who had once offered a crayon drawing to an armored warrior, and found in that single unguarded gesture something that unsettled the entire philosophical foundation of the Dominion more than any weapon ever could. They found hope, freely given, without any expectation of return. Word of Kaloth Station spread quietly through Varathi ranks, not as a story of conquest, but as a legend of the one time an empire that had never lost, chose not to win. Serath, the young warrior who had once called humanity weak, returned to Kaloth Station 18 months later, not as a soldier, but on his own initiative, carrying with him a small, carefully preserved piece of paper. He found Mira, now 9 years old, in the station's hydroponics bay. "I kept it," he said quietly, holding out her original drawing, the crayon lines slightly faded but intact. "I did not understand it when you gave it to me. I think perhaps I am only beginning to understand it now." Mira smiled. The same open, unguarded smile she had offered him nearly 2 years before, and said something that would later be recorded, translated, and studied across a dozen Varathi academies as the single most important sentence in the Empire's modern history. "That's okay," she said. "You don't have to understand it right away. You just have to keep it somewhere safe. That's kind of what love is, I think. Just keeping something safe, even before you understand why it matters." The Varathi Dominion never did conquer Earth, or any world humanity called its own. Not because they lacked the power. Their fleets remained as ever, capable of ending humanity's presence among the stars in a single, devastating strike. They simply chose not to. Because somewhere in the quiet corridors of Kaloth Station, in the space between a threatened annihilation and a small girl's fearless kindness, the Varathi Dominion encountered something their 11,000-year empire had never once accounted for in all its calculations of strength. A species whose greatest weapon was not their capacity for violence, but their stubborn, unshakable refusal to stop caring for one another, even in the shadow of their own destruction. Zoreth Van would go on to become the first Varathi ambassador to humanity, a position that did not exist in Dominion history before him, and would spend the remainder of his long life studying a species he once dismissed as primitive, only to conclude, in a report submitted to Dominion Command decades later, that humanity possessed something the Varathi Empire, for all its conquests, for all its endless unbroken victories, had never once managed to build in 11,000 years. Not power, not fear, not obedience. They had built belonging. And in the vast cold silence of a galaxy that had learned to measure worth only in strength and conquest, that single, fragile, defiantly human thing turned out to be the one force no empire had ever been prepared to face. Not a weapon. A reason to keep going even when everything said you shouldn't. And for the first time in 11,000 years, an empire that had never known defeat finally understood what it meant to lose something far more important than a battle. They understood at last what it truly meant to be human. If this story moved you, subscribe for more human stories from the stars.